Hello, I'm Ed Rabyd, otherwise known as the Rabyd Atheist, a former pastor turned atheist, now a compassionate anti-theist. Welcome to my channel. You're free to like or dislike the video, so feel free to hit those buttons. Feel free to comment below. And I would appreciate it if you would subscribe to the channel and hit your notification bell for more content as it's released. You're also free to share my videos as much as you like. My purpose is education. And so, in particular, both atheist education plus a commentary on mostly on the Christian faith of which I came out of. Once again, I was a minister for 20 years, and so I'm kind of engaging some of the things I did as a minister, and only this time I'm coming at it as an atheist skeptic. And one of those things is the life of Jesus Christ. And so here we have this latest installment of The Tall Tale of Jesus, a Skeptics' Disharmony of the Gospels. And today we're going to deal with basically a very familiar story to a lot of people during Christmas, but the visit of the Magi found in Matthew 2, 1 through 12. Now, before I begin, I want to remind everybody of my criteria of my criticism. The first criteria of my criticism is actually biblical, where it is said that in the mouth of two or three witnesses, every fact is to be established. This is actually recorded both in the Old Testament and the New because Jesus says it. So, or reportedly says it. We'll talk about some of the things that Jesus says and whether or not they're authentic or not later. But this is the visit of the Magi. Now, up until this point, I have continued to make the point that none of the events of Jesus' early life are actually collaborated by any more than one witness. In fact, many of the events could have only been witnessed by the people that were participants in those events, and often those people were one person. One of the particular ones is, of course, Zacharias in the temple, and then you have Mary with Gabriel, and a couple other cases like Joseph hears a dream. Only he could have collaborated that. So this is kind of, those ideas are simply this, that so far we're still waiting for actually two gospels to talk about the same story. We really haven't had that at all. The only thing that we've had that's been in both gospels is the genealogies, and the best that we can say about them is, one, they're completely different, and two, yeah, maybe we are dealing with genealogies, one from Mary's side and the other one from Matthew's side. But what we have at this point is no stories of Jesus' early life are even collaborated by a second witness of the Gospels themselves, let alone any second historical witness. So that's our first criteria, which is, the two or three witnesses issue and the nature of those witnesses. The second criteria is anything else that I find odd, unusual, contradictory, which I'll mention as we go through the text. But the visit of the Magi, Matthew 2, 1 through 12. It says, "Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem, saying, 'Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we've seen his star in the east and have come to worship him.' When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Gathering together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They said to him, 'In Bethlehem of Judea, for this is what has been written by the prophet. And you, Bethlehem, land of Judah, are by no means least among the leaders of Judah, for out of you shall come forward a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel.' Then Herod secretly called the Magi and determined from them the exact time the star appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, 'Go and search carefully for the child, and when you have found him, report to me, so that I too may come to worship him.' After hearing the king, they went their way, and the star which they had seen in the east went out before them until it came and stood over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. After coming into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they fell on the ground and worshipped him. Then, offering up their treasures, they presented him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned by God in a dream not to return to Herod, the Magi left for their own country another way." Okay, just as a reminder, my first criteria is two or three witnesses. Matthew is the only one that records the story, period. None of the other gospel writers touch it. There is no record in historical antiquity that this even took place. It is purely a solo shot story from Matthew. And in part, I think it's just to get the prophecy about him being born of Bethlehem in Judah out there. if you read Mark's gospel, for instance, there is absolutely no account of Jesus' birth. And probably because nobody thought it was important. But in this case, we now have Magi visiting. Now, the Magi are a mystery. A few little fun facts. One, it doesn't say that there were three of them, just that they gave three gifts. We're probably talking, from a historical perspective, if people were reading this passage back when it was written, they would have thought a caravan of people without necessarily a definite amount of people, okay? And we've seen his star in the east. Now, the weird part about the star, to me, and always seemed to be the weird part, is nobody but the Magi seem to be able to see it. Nobody's remarking about this, but yet it moves in such a way that the Magi can follow it to wherever Jesus is, but nobody else can see it. So, there's a little bit of magic here in this story, maybe a little bit of divination. Who knows what the hell it is. But the point is there's definitely magic going on here because this doesn't make a sense. Now, the Magi are theorized to be astrologers/astronomers because back then those two disciplines, those two areas of inquiry, I should say, the scientific discipline of astronomy and the spiritual discipline of astronomy went head to head together. There was no real separation between those two. So we have these guys that are knowledgeable, wise people that come to worship Jesus. Now, a little bit about the time frame at this point and what makes it problematic is when we last left Jesus, he was in the manger. Then he went to the temple when he was 8 days old. And then there's a gap in the story because the next thing that we'll deal with, which we'll deal with in the next episode, is Luke basically says that they went and settled in Nazareth. And we don't get that here in Matthew. In Matthew, they're still in Bethlehem. The word is no longer the word for infant. It's a word for child, which reflects usually a small, young child. So a lot of conservative scholars basically theorize at this point that Luke just has a gap in the story, which is a perfectly reasonable thing. There's lots of gaps in the story, in all the Gospels of the story of Jesus. Literally years pass before anything happens in a lot of respects. So I don't have a problem with a gap in the story. The interesting thing about this is if Matthew wrote first, which he did, or Luke wrote first, I'm going to take either way, why doesn't the other gospel writer take them into account? Either they were unaware of each other's presence, or which creates other problems, which probably would explain why some of them, they have differences between Luke and Matthew. But if they were aware of the other gospel, why wouldn't you write your gospel in such a way that you could overlap the stories and give a second witness to the stories? They don't do that. God, looking forward into history, into the future, would know what criteria would be demanded by human beings for the truth value of claims in the future, and yet he doesn't seem to want to meet those claims. And so here we have it. The other problematic thing about this is Herod. We know for a fact that Herod died, I believe, in 6 BC. Okay, if Jesus is 2 years old or so by this point, then that means that Jesus was actually born in 8 BC. But that's not when it's said to have been born. The real problem with a lot of the dating of Jesus' birth is caused by the fact that historically we know when Herod the Great lived. We know when Quintilius, the governor of Syria, ruled. And those two events, what we know to be true about both of them, doesn't jive with the story that's given both in Matthew and Luke. The dates just make it, it's a huge gap. It's like 10 or more years, depending on how you date it. And it becomes a real problem. Now, this really calls into question, of course, the inerrancy of the Bible, because it seems like if the Bible truly was inerrant, such an obvious historical fact would have been corrected by God himself as he inspired the scripture. But he doesn't seem to do that. So now we're left with this story, which is a nice romantic little story, but really to me it's a prelude to a horror story, which we'll talk about more next time. But what Herod basically is doing the old bait and switch. I'm going to go and worship him, go find him. Herod was notorious So it fits his character, but Herod was notorious, and anybody who had studied the life of Herod back then would have known that he was notorious for this one fact. Any claim to the throne other than what he felt was justified, either his sons or himself, was ruthlessly squashed. Okay, so nobody ever made this kind of claim. During Herod the Great's reign, there were several messianic figures that rose up to challenge him, but they were all crushed pretty quickly. He was brutal and he was ruthless, okay? And that's just the way he was. Later on, the other Herods would kind of have some of those same qualities, only not completely as dark side as Herod the Great did. That said, Herod the Great brought a lot of prosperity to Israel. He brought Roman plumbing, he brought Roman architecture, he brought all kinds of Roman help, gold, later on troops. And so from that standpoint, he was a very successful ruler. He was just extremely ruthless with his people at times. And, he did get the moniker the Great for the reasons of some of his accomplishments. But in all the accolades about Herod the Great and all the chronicles of his life, this is never mentioned, not once. There's no mention of him ever slaughtering babies either, which we'll get to in a minute, but there's no mention of Magi coming or anything like that, where there's no historical witnesses of the story outside of Matthew. The story reads nicely. After that, they come to the child, we've been searching for you. They lay out their gifts. And by this time, Joseph and Mary apparently have a house in Bethlehem. This has to be after his 8 days presentation in the temple, yet before the time that they go to Nazareth. So it's kind of in that time frame. I don't have a problem with the time frame. Some critics do, but I used to think that this was kind of a no-brainer to end the criticism, that you can easily postulate that, that there's a gap of time after Jesus is circumcised and prophesied over, and before they go to Nazareth, where this account in Matthew can be dropped as well. That no gospel writer is going to write the same stuff. Some of them are going to include different stories, which is fine and okay, except if you're the only one that relates that story, you're kind of a solo witness on it, and it's just kind of the way it is. So it's not really all that fun when that's the case, and because of that, there's just no historical basis to believe this story. We only have it in Matthew. Well, Matthew's a historical. No, for those of you Christians out there that watch this video, you need to understand something. If it's the historicity of the Gospels that's in question, you can't use the Gospels to verify each other. Okay, you can't do that. You have to find outsourced sources that verify the Gospels, that collaborate with the Gospels say. You can't just assume that they're all historical sources and use them to verify each other. That's just bad historical study. Okay, if Matthew has to have its claims proven historically with sources outside the Bible, period. Same with Luke, John, Mark, all of them. So, here we go. I don't know. If you want to believe in magic, this story makes a lot of sense. Magical, stars floating around. If you want to believe in prophetic voices speaking to you in your head, I guess this is a good story. The real problem I have with this story is what it'll lead up to. And that's kind of where, I got a little time here, so I'm going to go to that next. And it's what happens with the slaughter of the children. And I'm going to kind of introduce that a little bit, because maybe what we can do here with a little bit of time I have left is talk about the flight to Egypt. Once again, story only found in Matthew, not found in anywhere else. In fact, I almost think that he wrote this story just so he could use the prophecy, out of Egypt I called my son. Well, see, there it fulfills prophecy. The out of Egypt I called my son is in reference to Israel being called out of Egypt during the Exodus. It is never related to a single individual messianic prophecy. To pull that passage out of there and use it this way, the way Matthew, is to do the context of the passage a great disservice. I'm sorry, that's just true. Okay, so when the Magi leave and go another way because they've been warned by God in a dream. This is what the text says. Now, when they had gone, behold, the angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, Get up, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you. Herod is going to search for the child to destroy him. So Joseph got up and took the child and his mother while it was still night, and left for Egypt, and remained there until the death of Herod. There it was to fulfill what was spoken by the Lord through the prophet, Out of Egypt I've called my son. Out of Egypt I've called my son, once again, comes from a prophecy, a poem, a prophecy, as I recall, that deals with how God delivered the children of Israel out of Egypt using the 10 plagues and so on. It has nothing to do with a messianic prophecy. And for Matthew to use this, this kind of illustrates what I want to say about Matthew as a general rule. Matthew plays very fast and loose with prophecy. And it's very easy to do this when you write 50 years after the fact. You can take the events, okay, how do I mesh these Old Testament prophecies that I think are messianic with the life of Jesus? Well, I'll tell you how you do that. You just write a story that kind of fits the prophecy, and thus the prophecy is fulfilled. It doesn't have to be a true story, it just has to fulfill the prophecy. How do you know that this is a true story if it has no historical verification out of Matthew? You don't. You just don't. Matthew could be making this up, okay? Even if it wasn't written by whoever is writing the story, they could be making it up, okay? And it's easy to cast Herod the Great as a bad guy because not a lot of Jews liked him, okay? They thought that he was an illegitimate ruler because he wasn't of this line of descendancy of David. So, whoever those descendants are, have their lineage go back to whatever, but it still doesn't change the fact that don't know. And so Matthew plays really fast and loose with this prophecy, and gets it in here. There is no other historical data that they even went to Egypt, period. Luke ignores this, which seems strange to me. If Matthew writes first, then why wouldn't Luke include this? This is one of the cases that says Luke wrote before Matthew. But at the same time, if Luke wrote before Matthew, why would Matthew include this story when all he really needs to do is echo what Luke said? Unless, here's an alternate theory, Matthew and Luke are competitors in writing a story of Jesus. They're written about the same time, but perhaps, just perhaps, each of them is trying to write a better gospel than the other one, or one that appeals to the audience that they're trying to appeal to better. And so they specifically include the stories that'll make their case, or whatever case they're trying to make, and exclude cases that don't. Matthew is very much a guy trying to prove to Jewish people that Jesus is the Messiah. Luke seems to have a completely different agenda than that. It's almost like Luke says he's writing to put the record straight, but I think all he's really doing is putting the stories of Jesus that were commonly told straight, that he's going around getting as much information from the oral tradition as he can and saying, okay, this is what's common to all these stories. In which case, maybe the flight of Egypt isn't part of the oral tradition. Either way, whether Matthew wrote first or Luke wrote first, there's just some oddities that don't make sense unless A, they didn't know about each other's gospels, although it's pretty clear that they used another source that's often commonly referred to as Q as one of their sources, or they were writing completely different accounts of Jesus' life because they had a different agenda, or both. So I'm not trying to be contrary here, but we still don't have our 2 or 3 witnesses on any event in Jesus' life. We have literally gotten past Jesus being born, and we got this Herod guy about to kill him. The family packs up and leaves to Egypt, and we still have no historical collaboration of anything, and we still have no gospels, more than one gospel speaking on a story. Once again, the 2 or 3 witnesses is still lacking, and there's still a lot of oddities to the story, like the fact that Herod the Great would not have lived at the same time that Jesus was born. If Jesus is born in 4 BC, Herod has been dead for at least a couple years by that time, so it doesn't make sense for him to be a child of 2 years of age and for him writing the story. Unless the writer of Matthew is just picking a very convenient villain. Herod the Great was not liked by the Jews, and he's a convenient villain. So there you have it. I think that's going to be all for today. I kind of looked at the clock and realized I had a little extra time to get the flight to Egypt in. So thank you for bearing with me on that. I hope it doesn't make this video a little bit too choppy, but I didn't want to get that in as long as I had some time to do it. But I want to thank you once again for dropping by the channel. Feel free to like, subscribe, get your notification bell. Comment below to understand that I don't allow ad hominem name calling in the comments. So, prove your point. Don't shout insults at people. I just don't tolerate that. I'll just delete the comment. If you continue to be obnoxious, I'll block you. That's kind of the way it works. So far, I haven't had to do that, but I've had other social media platforms and other blogs and things, so that's kind of my rules about things. Keep it civil, keep it, you don't have to necessarily keep it clean, but keep it civil. Thank you once again for stopping by my channel, and hopefully one day I can convince you to be a rabid atheist like myself. In the meantime, this is Rabyd the Rabid Atheist, wishing you a good day and stay safe.